Have you ever thought that being a good person in certain situations can become a burden? Being good doesn't always mean being just or truthful, and it can even lead us to perpetuate oppressive systems. Today, we're going to explore the paradox of being a good person and how writer George Orwell, with his sharp critique of authoritarianism and social hypocrisy, left a warning to the world about the dangers of misplaced goodness. Prepare to reflect on the dark side of being too good. George Orwell, author of classics like 1984 and Animal Farm, was one of the greatest critics of social hypocrisy and abuses of power in the 20th century. In his works, he warned us about the danger of a goodness that, on the surface, seems virtuous but in practice conceals injustices and abuses. Orwell understood that the idea of being a good person can often be manipulated to perpetuate oppressive or unjust systems. In 1984, for example, the ruling party uses slogans like "war is peace" and "freedom is slavery" to mask their true intentions. They claim to act for the common good, but in reality, they are using this facade of goodness to maintain absolute control over the population. Orwell believed that this moral hypocrisy was one of the most powerful tools used by authoritarian regimes and dominant elites. They present themselves as defenders of goodness, justice, and peace, while their real actions are tyrannical and manipulative. He warns us that if we are not critical and alert, we can easily become complicit in these power structures simply by accepting the narrative that they are acting for the greater good. In the contemporary world, we can see this same moral hypocrisy in corporations or politicians who promote social campaigns while exploiting their workers or destroying the environment. The facade of goodness hides destructive practices, reflecting exactly what Orwell feared: the ability of power to distort what it means to be good. He warns that being a good person is not just about acting in a morally acceptable way on the surface, but having the courage to question the true intentions behind actions that, at first glance, seem virtuous. Orwell also warned us about the danger of conformist goodness, the tendency to be a good person simply to avoid conflict or maintain superficial harmony. In 1984, he portrays a totalitarian state that uses the common good as a justification for controlling all aspects of its citizens' lives. The party imposes the idea that absolute control and the suppression of individual freedom are necessary for the greater good of society. The concept of goodness is distorted and used as a tool to maintain the status quo and silence any form of dissent. Orwell shows us that conformist goodness can be dangerous because, in trying to be good within the limits imposed by society or power, we end up accepting or even legitimizing injustices. The desire to avoid conflict or maintain superficial peace leads us to silence our own conscience, failing to question norms and practices that may be deeply unjust. By conforming to these structures, the good person often becomes complicit in the oppressive system, even if unintentionally. This kind of goodness is especially concerning because, in maintaining superficial harmony, people avoid confronting difficult truths. The desire to be socially accepted, to avoid confrontations, and to be seen as a good person can prevent someone from fighting against injustices, as any challenge to the system would be seen as disturbing or destabilizing. Orwell warns us that being truly good often requires the courage to confront society, the system, and even ourselves. In many situations, we see people who prefer to remain neutral in important debates to avoid trouble. For example, on issues of racism or social inequality, the choice not to take a stand to avoid arguments is a form of conformist goodness. By remaining silent, these people indirectly support the status quo and perpetuate the injustice that Orwell so vehemently criticized. The moral paradox that George Orwell presents in his works is deeply connected to the idea that superficial goodness can, paradoxically, turn into complicity with evil. Orwell believed that the pursuit of being seen as a good person without critical reflection could lead to the involuntary support of corrupt and oppressive systems. He challenges us to question what it truly means to be good and whether that goodness is based on genuinely just actions or merely a socially acceptable facade. For Orwell, the real danger arises when people believe that by following codes of conduct or maintaining a posture of neutrality, they are fulfilling their role as ethical citizens. However, this limited view of goodness often ignores the complexities of morality. Being good cannot just be about following rules or avoiding evil. It must involve a critical analysis of our actions and the system in which those actions take place. If being good means turning a blind eye to injustices or perpetuating oppressive practices in the name of social harmony, that goodness becomes harmful. Orwell also exposes the risk that misunderstood goodness can serve as a tool of control. He argues that those in power can manipulate goodness to justify their actions, using distorted morality to oppress and control the masses. In 1984, this is evident in the use of doublethink, where concepts of goodness and justice are used contradictorily, turning oppressive actions into something morally justifiable. The paradox, then, lies in how the desire to be morally correct can be exploited to reinforce injustice. For Orwell, true goodness requires courage and action. It's not enough to appear good. One must confront evil, question norms, and challenge the status quo, even if that makes us unpopular or places us in uncomfortable positions. The price of authentic goodness is often the need for conflict with a system or socially accepted values. A clear example of this moral paradox can be seen in virtue signaling, where people or companies publicly demonstrate morally correct behavior, but in a superficial way, without real commitment to the cause. Social media posts supporting social movements, for example, without concrete actions to combat injustice, illustrate how superficial goodness can mask a lack of real action. As Orwell warned, this goodness, that only appears good on the surface, may actually be perpetuating the status quo and avoiding the necessary changes. One of George Orwell's most profound warnings is the danger of manipulating goodness by those in power. In Animal Farm, Orwell illustrates how noble ideals like equality and justice can be distorted by those who seek control. At the start of the story, the farm animals rebel against the oppressive farmer, motivated by a sincere desire for freedom and collective well-being. However, as the pigs take control, those same ideals are manipulated to justify tyranny and exploitation. Orwell makes it clear that even the most just causes can be transformed into tools of control in the hands of manipulative leaders. Goodness and noble values, when not accompanied by critical questioning, can become weapons to manipulate the masses and maintain the status quo. The pigs in Animal Farm represent this kind of corrupt leadership, using the idea of goodness and progress to mask their true intentions of power and domination. This phenomenon of manipulating goodness is not restricted to fictional authoritarian regimes. Orwell believed that it also occurs in democracies, corporations, and social institutions. Leaders and systems often co-opt moral ideals to justify unjust actions. They create narratives of goodness that prevent questioning or resistance, as any criticism of these actions is seen as an attack on universal values such as peace or justice. Orwell warns us that, without a critical and watchful eye, goodness can become a mask for oppression. In the corporate world, many companies engage in greenwashing, pretending to be environmentally conscious and responsible while their real actions harm the environment. They promote an image of goodness, using marketing campaigns to appear committed to ecological causes. But in practice, they continue exploiting natural resources and contributing to environmental degradation. As Orwell pointed out, this manipulation of a just cause environmental protection serves only to maintain power and profit, without real commitments to change. Orwell teaches us that we must be vigilant about the use of goodness as a manipulation strategy. When goodness is used uncritically, it can be distorted and perverted to serve the interests of the powerful. True goodness must be accompanied by critical vigilance, questioning not only what is done but by whom and with what intentions. George Orwell also emphasizes the importance of individualism and moral courage in his warning to the world about the paradox of goodness. In 1984, we see the protagonist Winston Smith attempting to resist the oppressive party system, even knowing that this resistance could lead to his destruction. Orwell shows us that in a society where conformity and the suppression of critical thought are encouraged, the true act of goodness and justice is often the act of challenging the status quo. For Orwell, being a good person is not just about following social norms or fulfilling what is expected by the majority. True goodness is rooted in questioning, in the courage to go against the tide and fight for justice, even when that fight is unpopular or dangerous. Individualism, in this context, is not a selfish act, but an act of resistance to mass control. In 1984, the party uses collective conformity to maintain total control, destroying any possibility of rebellion by undermining individual autonomy. By eliminating independent thought, the party creates a society where people feel good for following the rules, but without ever questioning the system itself. Orwell warns us that true goodness involves the ability to think critically and resist social pressure. This often means going against established social norms, especially when those norms perpetuate injustices. Superficial goodness, shaped by conformity, can lead us to support systems that oppress and control, while authentic goodness requires the courage to be unpopular, to be seen as subversive or even dangerous by those who wish to maintain the status quo. Activists who fight against oppressive regimes or systems of injustice, even when they face persecution, are examples of individuals who place justice above social conformity. In many countries, people who expose corrupt governments, knowing that it could cost them their freedom or even their lives, demonstrate the moral courage Orwell defended. They understand that being good doesn't mean going with the flow, but having the bravery to challenge a system that pretends to promote good but actually perpetuates oppression. Orwell reminds us that true goodness is often a difficult and solitary choice. It requires each of us to make decisions based on moral principles, even when those choices put us at odds with society or power structures. The individual who seeks to be truly just must be willing to stand up alone if necessary against what is wrong. This type of goodness is radical, subversive, and transformative. The warning from George Orwell about the paradox of being a good person resonates deeply in our current society. He warns us that goodness, when superficial or conformist, can easily be manipulated and used to justify oppression and control. True goodness, according to Orwell, is rooted in the courage to question power, resist manipulation, and act with integrity, even when it means going against what is considered morally acceptable by the majority. The paradox of being a good person challenges us to reflect. Are we being good in a superficial way, accepting what is imposed on us? Or are we willing to confront injustices, even if it means being misunderstood or unpopular? As Orwell shows us, being a good person, in the deepest sense, requires critical thinking, courage, and often the willingness to challenge social norms in the pursuit of true justice.